Hey, welcome. My name's John Diaz. I'm a technical marketing manager with the Cloud Management Business Unit at VMware, and I'm going to talk today about using the vRealize Operations REST APIs. Normally I'm happy to stick around afterwards to answer questions, or if you're watching this on video, best way to get a hold of me is through my email address. You can also send me a Twitter message if you want. But I'm happy to answer questions about VROps or the REST API or anything related to operations. So let's dive right in. The documentation for the REST API is actually found on the vRealize Operations appliance. So any appliance node, it can even be a remote collector, you can go to the URL shown here to find the documentation. So there's no place for it offline currently. There was a project called Platypus. I think there is still actually a project called Platypus that took that documentation from the appliance and converted it into Swagger format. But that was back in 6.2 release. So it's still out there on code, vmware.com, or VMware code, either way. But it's pretty dated. So it hasn't been updated in a while. I have been pushing on product managers to get the actual documentation converted to Swagger and put up on the VMware code site, so that people can access it there. But for now, this is where you have to go. There are really 3 APIs. I'm only going to focus on the public API, but I have examples for all of these. The public API represents basically everything that you can do in the user interface for vRealize Operations. Almost everything. So there are a few things that we don't expose. The most common one I get questions about is the workload placement. There's no APIs, no public APIs for that. For example, the costing, no public APIs for that today. But hopefully, we'll get that in the product soon. The internal APIs are available. The reason they're listed differently is because they are subject to change. There are some that have been in there for quite some time and should be hopefully promoted soon into the public API, but you can consider the internal APIs as kind of a staging area. When they have new APIs come out and they're not really sure if that's the final implementation for those APIs, they'll land in the internal. So the documentation's in the same place on the appliance, but just be aware that if you do use the internal APIs, there's a header that you have to add to that, or else the request will fail. So just make a note of that. If you don't put the header, it's not a big deal. You'll get a message back, a return code that says you need this header. So you'll figure it out one way or the other. The final one is CASA. And CASA is the cluster management for vRealize Operations. So this API actually will allow you to deploy VROps nodes, to configure the cluster, license it, anything related to cluster management. We actually use this in our demo lab in tech marketing to do a weekly rebuild of one of our demo environments. So people can come in, they have full admin access, they can kind of play around, build dashboards. If they break it, that's fine. Every Sunday night at, or Monday morning at 2 a.m., I think is the time it's set to, we actually have a script that runs these API calls and just rebuilds a new instance from scratch, connects it to the adapters to all of our vCenters, the whole 9 yards. So you can even use this. A lot of people maybe aren't interested in deployment necessarily, but it is a good API for doing things like upgrades. So you can actually push the pack file upgrades through this API as well. So it could be handy to do that versus doing it manually through the admin UI. The other thing that I would point out, and I put this under documentation because it kind of is, but there's and actually I misspelled that. There should be an A between the E and the O, but there's part of the REST format that's called Helios. And what this means is, and you can look it up and get the full definition and everything, but what that means is the response that you get back from any request that you, most requests, a GET basically, into the vRops API will return these links. There'll be a section with these links. And what's helpful about this is these links say this was a REST call to get a resource, get a VM. And then part of that is going to be the VM ID. And what's nice is they've already got these links pre-built for you, so you can just pull them out of the response and put them in the next request to do things like, get me all the relationships of the resource, or there's ones for metrics, get all the stat keys of the resource, or get the latest stats. So they're pre-built for you. So you can use those as part of your code, or it's helpful too if you're just getting started and you don't want to keep flipping back to the documentation. A lot of times the link that you're looking for, the next logical step, is included in that Helios response. So it's part of that payload. The other thing I want to talk about before we get into the getting started piece is the authentication. So there are two types of authentication. If you're just playing around, the basic is probably the easiest. If you've ever worked with REST APIs, you know that it's basically just a single header with name and password as the value. So nothing really different there. Authorization header. The auth source is something that you want to pay attention to, because the auth source is the same as when you pull down, when you first go into the vRops landing page and you pull down and it shows you like local and then maybe your vCenters. If you have AD connection, it'll show you. So whatever name is in that pull down list, basically the name that you've used to identify that authentication source is what you would use here, okay? So people sometimes think this is like username domain, and it's not. It's username and then the auth source from that list. Local, by the way, is default. So if you do just admin, all you have to put is admin. You don't need to put @local, for example. And of course, we have token-based authentication. And really, this is what you would want to use for when you're building code. This is fine for testing. And we'll talk about some performance things that you want to be aware of. But when you use the token, it saves a lot of time. It's less costly for repeated calls into the API, because if I'm using the basic, it's actually doing a lookup against the auth catalog every time, or the auth service every time. Here, it's just checking to make sure that the token is still valid. So get comfortable with using this as your building code, and I actually have examples of using this, and that's how my, the next part, this Postman collection, sorry, lost my train of thought. Postman collection works. So I've got this available, and this long string here goes out to the sample exchange on Code VMware, and you can either do that, or you can search for vRealize operations REST or Postman vRealize operations, my name, whatever will get you to that link. But you can download that if you have Postman installed, or you install Postman. You just import that collection in. It's just an XML file. You import it into Postman. And then the other thing that you'll need to do is create an environment, because I make liberal use of variables throughout the samples that I have in there. So at a minimum, to get started, you need an environment that specifies your vRops instance, and then a basic username and password for you to authenticate with to get a token. So once you have that set up, and you can see here that I've selected the environment that I created, vRops, and then you'll see in the collection, the list of REST calls, there'll be something that says run this first, and it's under the authentication. So what I'm doing here is going and actually making that REST call that gets a token. So you get a bearer token as part of this call, and you can see here the variables, where I place the variables in the double curly braces. So that's pulled from the environment. So you have the VROps instance, which would be the IP address or FQDN, and then the username and password that you provided. You have to do a basic authentication first to get the token, obviously. But once we have the token, I actually have a test running here, and I'll show that extracts the token and adds it as a variable into that environment. So here's the response that you would get from that initial call to authenticate. You'll get this token. You'll get the validity in both a timestamp format and then a human readable format of when that expires. As long as you keep using the token, it won't expire. But if you stop using it, then it will expire. I want to say it's like 4 hours, some time period like that. If it does expire, you get a message back, not authenticated, or the token's invalid. You can just run that previous workflow again to refresh or get a new one. But you can see this is a long string to have to remember and copy, paste, and so forth. So what I've done is I have these pre and post scripts throughout the examples. And here's my run first to get the authentication token. And you can see here that this is just some JavaScript that basically pulls the bearer token value out of the response that we just looked at, the previous response. And then it adds it as a environment variable, this set environment variable, bearer token, and then it sets it with the value of the token that we got. So that's taken care of for you. So when you look again at the environment, okay, you can see this is one that I've used a lot, and there's much more information in here than just the IP, username, and password. Now I've got things like, here's my bearer token, so that automatically got added. I have, for some REST calls that you make, you need the timestamp in Epic format, right, Unix format. So I actually have a pre-script that runs in those REST calls that will go out and grab the current time in Unix format, put it into the environment as a variable, and then it'll actually calculate the previous 24 and put that in as a variable. And I use that for the get stats query so that you can see an example of give me the stats from the last 24 hours. And if you look at how the REST call is formulated, you have to supply, the Unix time format. So I just take care of a lot of that for you in the samples just to make it easier for you to get started. So if you're not familiar with Postman, these are some things that you just want to pay attention to or figure out how they work, and it'll make it a lot easier for you to consume these samples. So now you're ready. You've got your authentication done, you've got your tokens, and you can start using the samples. And I have them organized by use case. So generally speaking, the way I have these is, you start with the top one and you just work your way through. And I use the reports folder as an example of that. So a lot of these are based on what customers ask me is like, oh, how do I run a report through the API? So I go through the steps and then I just save it here. So whenever I get a query from a customer about how to do something and I help them, I try to update this, my collection, with that information so that other customers can benefit from that. So be sure to check back to that sample exchange frequently, because I do update it, not once a week or anything, probably once a quarter, maybe go back and check, and there'll be more examples. One of the latest things we added were samples for that Casa API. So some of the stuff, all the samples, all the REST calls that we use in our lab to deploy a brand new cluster, and it's a full cluster with a master. It's got 2 data nodes. I don't think there's a remote collector in it, but it's a nice little cluster. But all the REST calls that we use in that script are included here, so you can see that. So that was something we added just recently. But for the most part, all of these, if you open them up, use case driven, just follow the steps. Unfortunately, I don't document each of the APIs, very thoroughly, other than maybe what it does or if there's some cautionary note or something like that, because I expect that you're going to be, you'll have the API documentation up in another window or something like that. If you use this and you find it valuable, or you have suggestions how it could be more useful, I would love to hear those. This has gotten a few downloads, not a lot, but the people that I have heard from that use it have been pretty successful in just learning how to use the REST API for vRops. So I think that's it. Let's talk about performance real quick. We already talked about using the bearer token or the token authentication for repetitive REST calls. You're not going to notice a big difference if you're just doing basic versus token-based in your, just playing around or exploring. But if you write code and your code is making a lot of REST calls, I guarantee it'll be, for even a simple script, it'll be the difference between seconds and milliseconds and using one or the other. So you can extrapolate that and see how big of an impact that would be. Even more impactful, and this is a common mistake that I've made and many others who get started with this REST API have made. If you want to get, a good example of this is if you want to get the CPU stats for all the VMs in your environment. So I want to know CPU ready for 2,000 VMs, let's say. If you do the get API resources stats latest for each resource, it's going to take a very long time because it's making literally a call for every one of those. Plus, it's adding overhead to your vRops node as well, which could impact the vRops performance or UI performance. What is better to do is to use a query. So you'll see in the documentation references to, it'll say get stats for resource, singular form, and then it'll say query stats for resources, plural. Every time you see query, that means it's going to be a post operation and there's some body information that you need to put out for that query format, like give me either the resource IDs or some other information so I can find the appropriate resources, the stat keys that you want, and so forth. I find it better to just use what we may call the shotgun approach, where I would rather make a single call, get way more information than I need, and then parse that information down to what I actually need in my code. It's much quicker that way than surgically getting exactly what I want with repetitive calls, okay? So this is probably the biggest thing that I see happen. And by the way, if you just want to get metrics, if that's your only, interest in the API, you're certainly welcome to use the API for that, but there is a fling out there called the VMware vRops export tool that actually uses the API, and it's a little more user-friendly and will actually export into different formats and things like that. So if your only need is to get metrics out, I would look at that. But otherwise, for other use cases, absolutely use that. So that's it. That's my presentation. Thank you very much for your attendance today. Hope this was helpful.
Thank you.